Hello there, Daren Willcock here, and this is Back to the Book. So today I want to look at an article from the Natural History Museum's website, which is entitled When Whales Walked on Four Legs. So grab a cup of coffee because we're about to wade through some murky waters. Now, the Natural History Museum has given us this narrative about whale evolution that reads like a children's bedtime story, to be honest. It's complete with vivid characters, dramatic transformations, and a satisfying ending. But here's the thing about bedtime stories. They're designed to make you sleepy and not to think critically. So let's wake up and examine this article sentence by sentence, and I want to show you how much of the so-called science is actually assumption dressed in a lab coat, and why the transitions described are not just unproven but logically impossible. So let's begin. This is on the left there. You'll see an artist's impression of a creature called Pakicetus, which is supposed to be the ancestor of the other creatures you can see on the page here, the whales and the dolphins. So bear that in mind. That's the claim, okay, that something with four legs and a snout with a nose on the end of its snout and lived on land somehow changed into what you see before you there. So the first line of this article is basically this: early ancestors of the ocean's biggest animals once walked on land. Follow their extraordinary journey from shore to sea. So there's a problem here. This isn't a statement of fact. It's a conclusion presented as a premise. So notice the rhetorical trick here. Before presenting any evidence, the author tells you what to believe. You're being asked to follow a journey that hasn't been demonstrated yet. So there's a logical fallacy at play here, which is begging the question. The claim assumes what it needs to prove. Whether these animals are actually ancestors of whales is precisely what needs to be established, not asserted at the outset. And I think this is dishonest. I think what honest writing would say would be that some scientists believe that certain land mammals may have been ancestral to modern whales. Let's examine the evidence. So can you see the difference? One invites investigation, the other demands compliance. So let's look at the second part, second sentence of this article, which reads, although whales are expert swimmers, hang on, let me get to it. Although whales are expert swimmers and perfectly adapted to life underwater, these marine mammals once walked on four legs. Well, this is another problem, because perfectly adapted is doing some heavy lifting here. I mean, if whales are perfectly adapted to water, that creates an interesting problem for the evolutionary story. How do you get from perfectly adapted for land to perfectly adapted for water without passing through poorly adapted for both? And in evolutionary circles, this is known as the fitness valley problem. So to get from peak A, which would be functional land mammal, to peak B, which would be a functional marine mammal, you have to descend into a valley of reduced fitness. But natural selection doesn't allow that. It ruthlessly eliminates creatures that are less fit than their competitors. Every intermediate would be worse at walking on land, worse at walking than land animals. So if it's gradually starting to transition into the marine environment, it's going to be worse at walking than the land animals it left behind. It's going to be worse at swimming than aquatic animals, and it's going to be outcompeted in both environments. So natural selection should eliminate these intermediates, not preserve them for millions of years. So there's a hidden assumption here, which is the phrase once walked on four legs is stated as established fact. But this is the very claim under dispute. Where's the evidence? We haven't seen any yet. Well, granted, we're only on sentence 2. So let's move on. Their land-dwelling ancestors lived about 50 million years ago. So again, there's a few problems here. Their ancestors. Again, it's assumed, it's not demonstrated. And secondly, this 50 million years ago stated with remarkable precision for something nobody observed. And this date probably comes from radiometric dating methods applied to the rock layers where the fossils were found. But radiometric dating involves assumptions about initial conditions and decay rates and contamination that cannot be verified for samples allegedly millions of years old. The method assumes what it aims to prove, that the Earth is old enough for such dates to be possible. And thirdly here, there's no uncertainty expressed at all. Real science acknowledges uncertainty. About 50 million years ago sounds precise, but it's actually covering a potential error range of millions of years. So for instance, a 10% margin on 50 million is 5 million years, and that's longer than all of recorded human history by a factor of about 1,000. So it doesn't add up to me. Let's continue. Meet Pakicetus, a goat-sized four-legged creature that scientists recognise as one of the first cetaceans, the group of marine animals that includes dolphins and whales. So this is an artist's impression of Pakicetus on the left there. The claim is that it eventually turned into what you see on the right. Okay, so this is another problem here. And this is where it gets really interesting. Pakicetus is called one of the first cetaceans. But what makes it a cetacean? It's nothing like a cetacean. Cetaceans are whales, dolphins and porpoises and the like. So the original Pakicetus fossils consisted of partial skull fragments. And from these fragments, scientists reconstructed an entire animal and declared it a whale ancestor. And later discoveries revealed it was actually a fully terrestrial wolf-like animal. So there's a logical sleight of hand at play here. So calling Pakicetus a cetacean is circular reasoning, and here's how it works. So we need to prove land animals evolved into whales. We find a land animal, we call it a cetacean, and then say, look, land-dwelling cetaceans prove whales came from land. That's not evidence. That's just creative classification. Now, the real question is, on what basis is Pakicetus grouped with whales? Ear bones, we're told in other articles. But similar ear bone structures could indicate common design rather than common descent. So when you, for instance, when you find similar wheels on a bicycle and a motorcycle, do you conclude one evolved from the other, or that a designer used similar solutions for similar problems? Doesn't add up. Let's carry on. So how Pakicetus' descendants evolved into whales is one of the most intriguing evolutionary journeys known to science. A problem. This is pure rhetoric. Intriguing. The word intriguing here is doing a lot of work. And you know what else is intriguing? Unsolved mysteries. Things that don't quite add up. Puzzles we can't crack. So the word intriguing inadvertently admits that this story isn't straightforward. What's actually being said here is words to the effects of, we find this transformation really hard to explain, which makes it fascinating. That's honest at least, but fascinating doesn't equal factual. Let's have a look at the next line. Pakicetus, pictured above, looked nothing like a whale, but it would have felt at home in water. Okay, looked nothing like a whale. But then why call it a cetacean? If it looks nothing like a whale, swims nothing like a whale, lives nothing like a whale and breathes nothing like a whale, maybe it's not ancestral to whales. And this phrase here, it would have felt at home in the water. How could anyone possibly know this? Pakicetus is extinct, right? We can't observe its behaviour, its preferences, or even its feelings. This is pure speculation presented as fact. Another logical fallacy at play, anachronistic projection. So they're attributing feelings and comfort levels to an animal based on what they need it to feel to fit their narrative. My dog feels at home in water when I take him to the lake. That doesn't make him a transitional whale. It's crazy. Oh dear. Let's carry on. Next sentence. it lived on land and on the edge of lakes and riverbanks in what is now Pakistan and India. That's why it's called Pakicetus, because it was found in Pakistan. So the problem again, how do we know where it lived? We know where its fossils were found, but that tells us where it died, or it doesn't even actually tell us where it died. It tells us where its remains were possibly transported, and it doesn't necessarily tell us where it lived. So there's a big assumption here. Fossils found in sedimentary rock near ancient water sources are interpreted through uniformitarian assumptions that slow, gradual processes over millions of years deposited these layers. But rapid, catastrophic flooding, say a global flood, could deposit animals from various environments into similar locations. That's why you have these fossil graveyards where you've got hundreds and hundreds of different types of creatures found in a certain restricted area. Utah's a good example of that. I think it's Utah. They've got like there's a national park there with a huge dinosaur fossil graveyard. Anyway, let's carry on. So it hunted small land animals and freshwater fish, and could even hear underwater. Okay, problems here. Hunted small land animals and freshwater fish. Based on what? I mean, tooth structure, stomach contents. I mean, soft tissue like stomachs, they don't typically fossilize. So this is pure inference. There's no observation going on there whatsoever. And then they say it could even hear underwater. And this claim probably based on ear bone structure, but many land mammals can hear underwater to some degree. The ability to hear underwater doesn't make something a whale ancestor any more than my ability to hold my breath when I go swimming makes me a dolphin ancestor. It's just ridiculous. Let's continue. What's this? Let me just go back. Hang about. I'm just going to read it because I haven't got the slide. So the next sentence says, eventually the relatives of this animal ventured further into the water and evolved to cope with their new environment. And this is the crux of the entire argument. So let's slow down here. Eventually, this word eventually is doing, it covers over the complete absence of mechanism. How exactly did this happen? What specific genetic mutations occurred? And in what sequence? How did each intermediate stage survive? And, this phrase, ventured further into the water. Animals don't decide to evolve. A creature that ventures into water doesn't thereby acquire flippers. This is really what they used to call Lamarckism. It's the idea that acquired characteristics are inherited, and this theory was discarded over a century ago. Wanting to swim doesn't give your children fins, and this phrase evolved to cope. So this phrase smuggles in teleology, which in other words purpose, where supposedly none exists. I mean, evolution, we're told, is blind and purposeless. It doesn't cope with anything. It doesn't try to solve problems. Random mutations either help survival or they don't. But the language being used here constantly betrays goal-directed thinking. But why? I mean, because the alternative, and they know it, I think, which is pure randomness producing integrated complexity, is really too implausible to state plainly. And so you've got a massive unstated problem here, which, what environmental pressure would cause a land mammal to become aquatic? You think about it for a minute, right? So if the land environment was hostile, the animal would go extinct before it even had time to adapt. And if the water environment was hospitable, animals already adapted to water would outcompete the newcomer. So every intermediate stage would be worse at both land and water than the specialists. And again, this is the Fitness Valley problem. Natural selection should prevent these transitions, not enable them. Okay, so the next sentence in this article says, one species of these relatives was called Pakicetus. And it lived in or near estuaries about 50 to 48 million years ago. Now, if you look at on the left there, The diagram at the bottom shows what they actually found, and then you've got a diagram of the reconstruction, and the actual reconstruction you'll see in museums, but it's actually just created from fragmentary pieces of bone, and kind of put together theoretically. They didn't actually find a full specimen. So this creature, Ambulocetus, the word actually means walking whale, and it's a name that presupposes the conclusion. It's like naming a suspect, obviously guilty Jones, before the trial. And the fossil evidence for this, as I said, it's Ambulocetus is known from incomplete specimens, and the reconstruction showing a whale-like creature, it's heavily interpretive. The actual fossils leave substantial room for alternative interpretations, and this dating issue here, 50 to 48 million years ago, overlaps with Pakicetus, who was supposedly around 50 million years ago. So if your ancestor and your descendant lived at the same time, that's not lineage, that's their contemporaries, really. Okay, let's move on. Like Pakicetus, it spent time both in and out of water, but its large feet looked more like flippers than its ancestors' longer legs. It also used its tail for swimming. Okay, there's a few problems here, and these are two different artist impressions based on the fossils of what this creature may have looked like. But as you can see, it's nothing like a whale yet. It's more like an otter, maybe. It's still got a nose on the end of its snout, not a blowhole on top of its head. But we really don't know what it looked like at all. It's conjecture. But anyway, let's look at the problems here with these phrases. So the first one is looked more like flippers, and like more like is doing a lot of work. Otter feet look more like flippers than dog feet, but otters aren't transitional whales. And then it talks about its ancestors' longer legs. Well, Pakicetus is now definitively the ancestor. When did this get established? It was just asserted, never demonstrated. And they go on to say it also used its tail for swimming. So what? Many animals use their tails for swimming. Crocodiles, beavers, otters, even dogs to some extent. I mean, tail swimming does not indicate whale ancestry. Again, it's all conjecture. So there's a dilemma here, which is the half foot, half flipper dilemma. And let's think about what feet and flippers actually do. So the feet are designed for weight bearing on solid ground. They're designed for grip and traction and sort of articulated movement, so ankles, toes, joints that bend in multiple directions. If you put a big toe out, which I did playing beach volleyball once, you can't walk properly. Everything has to work together. And the feet have connections to leg bones optimized for walking, running or climbing. Now flippers, on the other hand, they're designed for hydrodynamic propulsion. They're either rigid or semi-rigid structure, and they need to have minimal drag, and they have a connection to a body optimized for swimming. And now here's the question: what does a half foot, half flipper do well? Can it walk effectively? Nope, it's too flat, too rigid, losing the articulation needed for terrestrial locomotion. Can it swim effectively? Nope, it's too jointed, too flexible, creating drag instead of thrust. So an animal caught in the middle is worse at both tasks than its ancestors and its supposed descendants. It's outcompeted on land by animals with proper feet, and it's outcompeted in water by animals with proper flippers or fins. Okay, let's carry on. So it says here in the next sentence, further along this evolutionary journey, we find Dorudon, which lived 40 to 33 million years ago. Well, hold on. That's a pretty big switch. Let's just go back. Look, you've got an animal there with 4 legs, basically. And then when we switch over to Dorudon, looks to me like we've got a whale. Now we've got a proper whale, at least. I'm not sure whether if there was a blowhole on top of its head. I think there is. Can't really see from that reconstruction. But anyway, we've gone from hind legs to flippers. That's not a gradual change. That's a completely different animal. So, if you think about what they're saying here, it says further along this evolutionary journey. The journey is assumed. We're just being shown stops along a presumed route. And, finding fossils at different geological locations doesn't prove they're connected by descent. I could find a bicycle, a motorcycle and a car buried at different depths in a quarry somewhere, but that wouldn't prove motorcycles evolved from bicycles, right? And also there's this time gap here. We've got like approximately, what would that be? 8 to 15 million years between Ambulocetus and Dorudon. Okay, so where's the intermediate forms? We jump from large feet that look more like flippers to proper flippers. Look at this. There's proper flippers. These aren't feet anymore, right? There's no feet on this thing. None. It's a whale. It's a massive morphological change with no documented intermediate types. Okay. Let's move on. So this there's a diagram here of comparing its size with a human. So this 5 meter long animal had proper flippers and tiny hind legs. It lived entirely in the water and was a good swimmer. It also gave birth to its young underwater. Okay. So again, as I just said, we've gone proper flippers, right? They're stating it's got proper flippers. So we've gone from feet to feet that look more like flippers to proper flippers. And the middle stage is very poorly documented, but we're assured transition happened. Tiny hind legs. So you can't really see it that well on this particular picture. Let me see if it is on the next one. Hang on. No. But on some of the fossil reconstructions, you can see these strange little legs kind of 3/4 down towards the tail. But the thing is, you've got these vestigial looking structures and they're often cited as evidence of land ancestry. The problem with this is that vestigial doesn't mean useless. In some whales, I think that these structures can serve as reproductive functions, and assuming they're evolutionary leftovers rather than designed features is interpretation, it's not observation. And then it says it gave birth to its young underwater. I mean, yeah, it might have done, but you still don't absolutely know that. We don't have fossilized birth events. So again, it's inference based on the assumption that Dorudon was fully aquatic. But I would go with the idea that it did give birth underwater, because to me it looks like a whale. Okay. It doesn't look like this is a transitional whale. This looks like a whale now. And nothing like this so-called creature Ambulocetus. So, but with the birth, I want you to think about this. The birth situation is important because I think this is one of the most underappreciated problems in the whole story that they're putting together here. Land mammals give birth one way, whales give birth a completely different way, okay? And there's no viable transition between them. So let me explain. With most land mammals, if it's a successful birth, the baby emerges head first or feet first. It doesn't matter too much, but the baby takes its first breath immediately. The mother can take her time. The baby isn't going to drown. It's on land, it can breathe air. Not so with whales. Now with whales, the baby emerges tail first, and that's crucial. Head first would mean drowning during the birth process because whales have to breathe air from the surface. And once the babies come out, the baby has to be pushed to the surface immediately for its first breath. And so the mother has specialized instincts and behaviors to ensure this happens. She just automatically does it, pushes the baby right to the surface. And the baby has the instinct to hold its breath during birth and it swim up to the surface, and then it takes its first breath. So there's a big problem here. How do you transition from one system to the other? There's nothing in between giving birth on land and giving birth aquatically. There's no halfway house here, none. So I mean, a semi-aquatic mammal giving birth in shallow water faces a crisis. If the baby emerges head first, like most land mammals, it may drown before fully emerging. If it emerges tail first, then if it comes out tail first, but the mother still hasn't developed that instinct yet to push it to the surface, it drowns. If the baby lacks the breath holding reflex, it drowns. And if the baby cannot swim immediately, it drowns. So, every single component of the marine birth system, every single part of that must be in place simultaneously or the baby dies. And dead babies don't pass on transitional genes. So you've got this whole idea of gradual evolution, but this would have all had to happen absolutely at once. Something that lived on land and gave birth on land would have then had to have given birth to something that lived in the water and could give birth in the water. That's impossible. It's just, there's no plausible mechanism for that whatsoever. So just have another look at this creature. So, we've got a blowhole problem as well. And this is another impossible transition. And I think that the article glosses over this completely. A land mammal breathes through nostrils at the end of its snout. An aquatic mammal like a whale, or a whale specifically, breathes through a blowhole on top of its head. Now you get out other aquatic mammals or semi-aquatic mammals that breathe through a nose on the end of its snout, like seals and walruses, etc. But they're not totally aquatic. Now, so you've got a whale with a blowhole, right? And that's not a minor tweak. That is a complete relocation of the respiratory opening. Now you think about what this requires, right? The nostrils would need to migrate millimetre by millimetre over generations from the front of the face to the top of the skull. But, here's the catch. At every single stage of this migration, the creature needs to breathe effectively. So when the nostrils are, say, halfway up the face, if I had nostrils here, how does the animal breathe while eating? And when the nostrils are on the forehead, but you're not yet connected to the specialised muscles that snap a blowhole shut, how does the animal avoid drowning? The blowhole requires a complex system of muscles and valves and natural pathways that work in perfect coordination. And when did these develop? They would all have had to develop at once to be functional. Did they develop before the nostril moved, after, during? An animal with nostrils sort of awkwardly positioned partway up its skull, without the corresponding muscular and neurological systems to make that position functional, doesn't have a transitional advantage. It has a death sentence. So this logical problem you've got here, natural selection can only preserve traits that provide a survival advantage right now. Okay, it cannot plan ahead. It cannot say, okay, this half-formed blowhole will be really useful in 10 million years. A creature with dysfunctional respiratory system gets eaten, or it drowns, or it starves. It doesn't pass on its genes. It's crazy. So let's carry on. So within 10 million years from the age of Pakicetus to Dorudon, cetaceans had completely adapted to life in the water. That sounds like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, this is considerably fast. So there's a big admission here, and even the author acknowledges that this is considerably fast. So this should raise some red flags. If your theory requires extraordinarily rapid change, and rapid change is improbable under your theory, because after all, evolution is supposedly a slow process over countless generations of a genetic mutation here, genetic mutation there, a bit of environmental pressure here, a bit of environmental pressure there. You've got a big problem. So let's look at this. Let's think about what the 10 million years means for evolution in terms of the math. So the average mammalian generation time, if you take from the smallest to the largest, but average it out, it's probably roughly something between 5 to 10 years. What I mean by that is, once it's born, at what point can it reproduce? So some animals very fast. I think mice maybe within a few weeks, but elephants a lot longer. But on average, let's say it's somewhere between 5 and 10 years. So 10 million years divided by 10 years equals 1 million generations at most. So in 1 million generations, you need simultaneous coordinated changes in a whole host of systems if you're going to go from a land mammal to a whale. So say take the respiratory system, well, the change required would be nostrils to the blowhole and the muscles and reflexes to make it work. The skeletal system, you have to go from legs to flippers and the spine for vertical undulation, right? And then the reproductive system, you've got birth orientation in terms of head first, feet first. You've got maternal instincts that have got to be baked into it so that the mother immediately takes the baby to the surface. And then you've got neonatal influence, reflexes needed in the baby itself. It's got to hold its breath before it gets to the water, and then it's got to know exactly what to do once it gets to the top. Okay. Then you've got the thermoregulation system. So most land mammals have fur to some degree. I know some don't have as much as others, but the fur is for thermoregulation, for keeping it warm. Then you've got to switch over to blubber, which is what whales have to insulate them. Then the sensory systems, very different in cetaceans. So, you've got to go from, you've actually not even a switch, is it? You've got to come up with something brand new, which is echolocation development, underwater vision. And I only know of two types of mammals that have echolocation, which would be the cetaceans and bats. And obviously no one's claiming that whales came from bats. So that system would have to, come into existence somehow. From what though? How do you go from just normal sight and sound or hearing to echolocation? And then for the diving system or diving physiological system, you've got to have, whales have collapsible lungs, and they can actually sink. Their blood is oxygenated, and then their muscles store oxygen, and then they've got to be adapted to very deep pressure. I think sperm whales are the deepest divers, but they take a series of deep breaths, oxygenate their blood, then blow the air out, their lungs collapse, and then they dive. Another huge one, right? They're in the sea. That's not fresh water anymore. No land mammals drink seawater. Now the kidneys have got to adapt now for saltwater processing. Totally different system. And then you've got the whole nursing aspect. All mammals produce milk, right? Well, all placental mammals do. So you've got underwater nursing with pressure squirting mammary glands. So think along the line that this whole journey that they're talking about, each change requires beneficial mutations, which are extraordinarily rare. Most mutations are either neutral or harmful. So the probability of getting all these changes, and there's hundreds of them that you need, in the right sequence, while maintaining viability at every stage within 1 million generations, let's say considerably fast, is a considerable understatement of the problem. I just don't see any mathematical solution to it whatsoever. So let's carry on. So it says, the next sentence says, the descendants of Dorudon went on to evolve into modern whales. So again, we've got an assertion stated as fact, demonstrated nowhere. And the problem here is that even if we accepted everything claimed so far, Dorudon to modern whales involves another massive transformation. Blue whales are up to 30 meters long and weigh 200 tons. Dorudon was supposedly 5 meters. That's a 6-fold increase in length and orders of magnitude increase in mass. So size changes require kind of coordinated modifications to circulatory systems, to skeletal structure, to respiratory capacity, to feeding mechanisms, and a whole host of other things. So each system must scale proportionately or the animal dies. Let me carry on. So here we go. About 34 million years ago, a group of whales began to develop a new way of eating. They had flatter skulls and feeding filters in their mouths. These are called baleen whales, which include blue whales and humpback whales. So on the picture on the right, you can see what baleen is. They've no longer got teeth, but they've got these like hair-like structures that act as like a sieve, basically. So this baleen is made of keratin. It's the same protein that your fingernails are made of. And it forms this complex filter feeding structure that strains tiny organisms from vast quantities of water. Now, here's what needs to happen for teeth to evolve into baleen. Teeth, first of all, teeth have got to become progressively less useful for the animal's current diet, okay? And simultaneously, keratin plates must begin forming. And these plates, they have to form, well, they've got to happen to grow in a pattern useful for filter feeding, right? Again, I can't see a transitional stage here. The animal's entire feeding behavior must also change. The skull's got to reshape to accommodate the new system. The tongue has got to adapt to work with the baleen, and the throat's got to develop expandable pleats for like gulp feeding, which a lot of the bigger whales do. So, you know, at what point during this transition does the animal successfully feed? So an animal with half teeth and half baleen catches neither fish nor krill effectively. You know, it starves to death before passing on its transitional genes. Okay, let's continue. Other whales keep their teeth. This group includes dolphins, porpoises, orcas, and sperm whales. That's an orca on the left and sperm whales on the right. But there's a big unasked question here. If some whales kept their teeth and others evolved baleen, why didn't the toothed whales outcompete the baleen whales during the transition? Toothed whales can catch food effectively. A transitional baleen whale cannot. There's no intermediate stage ever postulated for this anyway. I don't think there's ever been a fossil that shows anything halfway between the two. So the thing is, natural selection should have eliminated the baleen experimenters before they got anywhere. And the thing is, unless of course both types were designed separately for their respective ecological niches from the beginning. Okay, so what the fossils actually show, that's the question we got to look at. So someone might object, well, but we have fossils, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Dorodon, they're right there. Fair point, but consider what we actually have. First of all, we've got fragmentary remains interpreted through evolutionary assumptions. Creatures that may just simply be distinct kinds, fully functional in their own right, not transitional at all. And there's massive gaps between each form that still require the impossible transitions described above. So finding a creature that was semi-aquatic doesn't prove it was transitioning. Otters are semi-aquatic, hippos are semi-aquatic, seals spend time on land and in water. These aren't transitional forms on their way to becoming whales. They're complete functional animals perfectly suited to their ecological niche. Now, the coordination problem is huge, right? These aren't isolated changes. For a land mammal to become a whale, you need simultaneous coordinated changes in all of these. Well, I just stated respiratory system, the skeletal structure, the reproductive system, all of those, right, which we've gone over. And these systems, or rather each single one of these systems, they're irreducibly complex in its marine form. Each requires multiple components working together, and each transitional stage, it's got to be functional enough to survive and reproduce, and that's each individual system. So I think the statistical improbability of all these changes occurring in the right sequence at the right time while maintaining organism viability at every step, it's not just unlikely, I think it's actually impossible. I think it strains credulity, really. So let's look at the biblical framework. So what does the scriptures say about the origin of sea creatures? Well, if we look at let's see what we've got here. If we look at Genesis chapter 1 verse 21, it says, so then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. So let's look at the origin of the land animals, and you'll find that in Genesis the sea creatures come before the land animals on a different day. Land animals are made on day 6. So if we look at the origin of the land animals according to Genesis, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Now, the Hebrew word min, which is translated kind, it suggests distinct categories of creatures, each created to reproduce according to its kind. So this doesn't preclude variation within kinds. So dogs can diversify, into wolves, coyotes, chihuahuas. But it does suggest fundamental boundaries between major types of creatures. So a whale is a whale. A land mammal is a land mammal. The idea that one transformed into the other requires not just time, but a mechanism capable of producing coherent, functional, intermediate stages. And that's precisely what the evidence lacks. So let's recap here what we've looked at. So the claim in the article is that land animals became whales, and it's asserted repeatedly but never demonstrated. The claim is that Pakicetus is a cetacean, and the evidence for that, they quote, not in this article, but in other articles, they're talking about ear bone similarity. But that's circular reasoning because it assumes common descent, doesn't prove it. Then the claim is that Ambulocetus is a transitional form, but we've got very incomplete fossils, and what we do have, they've been heavily interpreted and presumed to be an ancestor. The other thing, the claim is all this happened in 10 million years, where you've gone from something that's obviously not a whale to something that kind of is, like Dorodon, for instance. And the method used for that would be radiometric dating, most probably. But that, again, it assumes uniformitarianism, and it's probably too fast for the 10 million years quoted there is probably too quick for these changes to possibly occur. They claim that the transitions were viable, but that wasn't really addressed. So, it's logically impossible at multiple points. The blowhole development wasn't addressed. And I don't think there's any way you can have a viable intermediate stage between a nose at the end of a snout and a blowhole on top of your head. The birth transition wasn't really addressed at all. It's an all or nothing system. The birth system. You can't have a halfway house there from giving birth on land to being completely aquatic and giving birth in water. And then we had that baleen development, and that's not the way that transition's not really addressed. But you would get starvation during transition if you've got teeth that are half baleen, half teeth. They're just not going to work. They're two totally different functional systems. So what do we actually have? What does the record show? Because we've all got the same fossils. The creationist scientist has got the same fossils as the evolutionary scientist. But what we actually have, the facts are that we've got several distinct animals. They're found in various locations. They're classified as related based on evolutionary assumptions. As this article does, they're connected by a story, a narrative, not observed transitions. And these claims are presented with certainty they just don't warrant. So, to conclude, you've got this story versus what I think is logic, in a sense. So that the Natural History Museum article is well-written propaganda. And I don't use that word lightly. Propaganda means information used to promote a particular point of view, and it's often with an appeal to emotions rather than logic and intellect. And all throughout this article, it states conclusions as premises. It uses engaging language to bypass critical thinking. It presents interpretation as observation. It ignores logical problems with the narrative, and it offers no alternative explanations. Granted, it admits difficulty, that considerably fast phrase, but without exploring the implications of that. So the evolutionary story of whale origins on the surface is like aesthetically appealing. It's got a nice narrative. You know, a creature goes into water, gradually adapts, becomes a whale, you know, very elegant. But narrative elegance isn't the same as logical coherence. When you actually work through the mechanical requirements step by step, system by system, you find that the transitions require creatures that cannot function, systems that cannot work partially, and coordination that cannot arise gradually. A lot of these changes would have to be all or nothing. And the fossils we have may simply represent distinct created kinds, each fully functional in their ecological role when they were in existence, not a sequence of transitional forms caught mid-transformation. So you've got a real choice here. You've got the evolutionary story requires random mutations producing integrated systems, natural selection preserving non-functional intermediates, all, listen, this is a big one, all required changes happening in the right sequence. And while that's all going on, you've got to have a viable organism all the way through. And then, as they admit, all this is happening considerably fast. Now listen, that isn't science. That's just faith in something other than a creator. See, for me, when I see integrated complexity, I see design. When I see distinct categories of creatures, I see created kinds. When I see a story that doesn't add up logically, I don't pretend it does just because someone with credentials tells me to. You know, Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." And maybe the whales do too. So thank you very much for listening. What do you think? Does the transitional story hold up when you examine the mechanics? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But if you like that, give us a like. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do. And I'll see you in the next one.